OOTC. Hey, that's cool.
You got a podcast?
Well, I didn't know that.
That's cool.
Now you do.
Welcome. We are back. Oh, that's cool. OTC's very own podcast on all the fantastic people we work with here at OTC. I am Jared Durden, and with me, as always,
is Andrew Crocker. Sir, how you doing?
I am fantastic.
Are you fantastic because it's the end of the semester, or are you fantastic despite the fact that it's the end of the semester?
I wouldn't go as far as despite. The end of the semester can be stressful. I feel like I've got all my ducks in a row. I always look at it as I could do better, but I feel like I've done a lot. I feel like my students are ready. It's in their hands. They're working hard. I'm looking forward to seeing them kind of show off, right? It's not a test. It's a celebration of knowledge.
Sure. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Do you do the traditional final exam?
They do a final, but it's not necessarily like the entire class cumulative final.
Mm-hmm.
In physics, I mean, kind of like with math, you can't do the second thing without knowing how to do the first thing.
May I start off with a celebration of knowledge a little bit here?
Okay.
I had the distinct honor of sitting in on Rock Farm podcast with our good friend Jeff Johnson.
You got to do your episode.
I finally got to do an episode, and it's about this may be a spoiler, not that I care. It's about Tom Waits, one of my favorite musical artists. After I've done so much research, because he has like 20 albums,
Yeah.
I did so much research. He may now be my favorite artist. Sitting there, you go, first of all, I hope you get a chance to do it, because you would be a great guest, Jared. But if you get a chance to go to his house, first of all, it's in Dallas County. So you're going a good ways out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a secluded, it's like he's under witness protection program from the feds. He's living out in the woods. And you get to meet his family. His kids are sharp as tacks. If you had a chance to listen to the podcast several times,
yeah.
His kids are great, super insightful. They mentioned a lot of stuff about Waits' music that I hadn't considered. And just in general, they are so much fun to hang out with and talk to. And just the fact that you get to how often do you sit around, honestly, music is a very individual thing. How often do you get to sit around and listen to music you love with other people who are also tapping their feet and saying, this is cool, that's great. That's so much fun. Shout out to Jeff Johnson. What a great podcast. And the fact that I got to do it, and I only love it more now, is so awesome.
I'm glad you brought that up, too, because I'm wanting to put together a list of all the podcasts on campus. And so we know of the Rock Farm. Michelle Selinsky talked about the Veterans Upward Bound doing one.
But they are not yet doing one?
I don't know if they've started it up again or not. We need to find that out.
The great John Herbert, who was with us.
He talked about one.
Yeah.
If they do one regularly.
He did, but he was never definitive about it.
So we want a list. If you're listening and you have a podcast on campus or you're aware of one, let us know either in the comments on the Facebook or on our Twitter page.
Let's get a network.
Let's start
get a network going.
together. Yeah, a podcast network.
Absolutely, yeah. And oddly enough, I know our students. I know our students across the student body have to have a few podcasts of their own. If you become aware of those, please let us know, folks. I know Politically Active has been talking for a couple of years about getting one going. We haven't ever gotten one off the ground, but we might now. Our leadership has been so stable that we might actually start doing one now. But that's student-led and student discussion. But which is, if you've ever been to a Politically Active meeting, is just as vigorous as any faculty discussion.
Absolutely. And so the idea being is we're actually going to work on an innovation celebration grant, and which we encourage you to do as well, to kind of expand on this a little bit, help us kind of set up maybe a podcast studio so that more people have access to creating content, and then possibly putting together a local server for RSS feeds so that we can kind of have our own podcast network.
Yes, so we could have many vigorous conversations with the best possible technology and the best people on campus helping us whenever we have glitches. I mean, Jeff Johnson has been so instrumental there, but we have an instructional media studio where you and I have recorded lectures in that room, and you have Gabriel Sands, Philip Arnold, people willing to help you at the drop of a hat. so invaluable. I've used it so much already, and I hope that we can make this vision come true. You're so good already, Jared, at making these visions, these grant visions of yours come true. I hope this one works out for you too.
Well, I'm looking for your help too.
No, sure. Yeah. Count me as your grant wingman.
Okay.
I can wingman you a grant.
So, the other reason why, it's a good mood today is you guys out there in podcast land, you're not listening to this until finals week. However, we're recording today on December 3rd. It is 73 degrees out on December 3rd here in Springfield, Missouri.
Yeah.
It of course has, again, we're seeing record average temperatures for the year. It's almost as if, I don't know, that there's been some kind of change to our climate.
It's almost as if the globe is warming.
Yeah. And so we brought on a guest today to talk a little bit about that. And with us today is one of my top 10 favorite people in the world. She is an adjunct here and is also our first adjunct instructor.
On this podcast, correct, yes.
Podcast. A retired school teacher and my mother-in-law, the one and only Pat Petersen.
Hey, welcome.
Good afternoon.
I am so glad that we can finally get somebody on this podcast with dirt on Jared. How deep does the dirt go?
I tell you what, I don't know about the dirt on Jared, but I have a lot of dirt under my fingernails.
Oh, there you go.
I'm in my garden every day, multiple times a day.
So, Pat, tell us, just for our listeners, a little bit about yourself and your relationship to the college.
Well, this will be my 21st year coming up. Actually, no.
That means
back, it'll be my 22nd.
I was about to say that would mean you would have started in 2000.
Yeah. This will be my 22nd year here at OTC. I have enjoyed my stay here. I taught in high school for a number of years Spanish and have exclusively taught English here at OTC. My primary interest is in research, both scientific and cultural. And so I guess you would say that my methodology is social and economic justice as well as environmental justice. And that is my approach to the content that my students read and also the content.
How are you able to work in, because those are obviously big things to tackle. How do you work those into an English class?
Well, first of all, I love research. And I think if you're, and I also make it a habit to keep up with what's going on in the research. So in other words, I am always reading about scientific discoveries. I'm also reading about social and political theory, a lot of history, and you have to have a fair amount of interest in economics as well. One of my favorite go-to guys for that is Paul Krugman. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
I'm familiar. I have a book of his, Conscience of a Liberal, I believe. Yeah. Interestingly, he was for years and years a diehard Republican, and it was actually during the Bush administration that he became disaffected with the conservative policies, economic policies, and really advocated for moving away from
corporate and capital interests, and because of the damage that it was doing to the middle class and the working class as well.
One of his big bugaboos of the last decade or so, which is why he's important to read right now.
Absolutely.
One of his big things that he's been hung up on is inflation scaremongering.
Mm-hmm.
Over the last couple Democratic presidencies, we've seen large legislation, multi-trillion-dollar legislation get passed, and consistently their political opponents, usually Republicans, accuse them of inviting the monster of inflation into the room. Mm-hmm. Krugman, across the board for the last couple decades, says this is just paranoia and inflation is not coming down the mountain. Well, we're in it now. We've seen a lot of inflation now. And I don't know. I don't think we'll know until the end of the pandemic how spooked by this we should be, but we're at least a little spooked. But he is one of the voices out there trying to tamp down the spookiness, saying that, this is more pandemic related than it is government action related. But an extremely insightful economist and very, very good at taking complicated topics and breaking them out for laymen.
He not only knows the U.S. economy very well, but he is very much in tune with the global economy as well. And so I think maybe that is partly where he might be coming from, that globally, even though we might see inflation, that globally there's not that much room to worry. Now, whether that's true or not, I have no idea.
Tell me about you. One of the things you like, obviously, you and I could go on about this for an hour alone. Jared, you might as well leave right now. But you also said
I'm not invited.
You are. I suppose you are. Yeah. I don't know. I guess now that I've found another Krugman fan, I tend to be very possessive.
I
tend to be very possessive.
So I tend to just let you have your fun.
What scientific discoveries have it? You mentioned you enjoy reading about scientific discoveries. What discovery over the last few years has really caught your imagination?
Well, this is going to surprise you. But the big scientific discovery that I'm most excited about is the fact that environmental scientists have finally wakened to the fact that if they want the average Joe to understand the science of climate change, they need to start publishing research with illustrations, graphics, and that is what I'm seeing just within the last 2 years when I'm looking up, for example, scholarly articles on insects. I'm finding not just a 25-page paper that is full of footnotes, right?
Or just tables of data.
Occasional tables and lots and lots of discussion that is totally beyond the average person. What I'm finding is this. I am finding a research discussion that is totally accessible for the average 7th grade reader. And so, and the findings are illustrated in a way that everybody can understand. For example, how important trees are in the process of transpiration. And what I mean by that is one of the biggest benefits to us from trees is that they are able to not only take water from the atmosphere, but they also take it from the ground. They pull it up from the ground, and then as a byproduct of photosynthesis, they transpire or suspire, if you will. One of the byproducts besides oxygen, the biggest byproduct is water vapor, and which is huge because if you've got plenty of trees in your neighborhood, guess what happens when nightfall comes around? The trees automatically go into air conditioned mode. They are suspiring water, which cools down the yards and even the houses. But if you don't have trees to do that then you have what the scientists are now terming urban deserts, where nighttime cooling doesn't happen. As we saw recently in Washington, D.C., the nighttime temperatures weren't dropping below 100 degrees. People cannot, even healthy people, cannot sustain that kind of heat for very long.
We are 2 or 3 weeks removed from the Glasgow Climate Convention. Did you track that at all? Do you have any thoughts connected to it?
I have not. This semester, I have not had a whole lot of time to do that.
Well, let me just, exactly on a point that you just made, one of the largest agreements from the Glasgow Convention was for, I think, like 100 countries agreed to stop deforestation and actually initiate reforestation, which I thought was very valuable. In particular, some countries, unfortunately, I didn't know Indonesia had a third of the world's rainforest. Apparently they do, but they kind of backed out a little bit of it. But very importantly, Brazil joined that. So over the next decade or two, Brazil will huge. And that's really, really important because of how important, the Amazon affects the planet. And that's one of the reasons. It's one of the reasons why climate change has accelerated so aggressively is because we've deforested. We've removed ourselves of these biological engines that take the carbon that is warming our planet and turning it into, as you said, the vapor and the oxygen that we need.
Well, yes, and of course, trees are the soil anchors. If you don't have trees, you don't have soil, as we well know from Iceland. Iceland is what scientists call a wet desert. And so there's plenty of rain, there's plenty of water, but there's no soil because it was completely deforested. And it's been very, very difficult to bring what few trees they have brought back, but they are determined to plug on and reforest as much as they possibly can.
So tell us, getting to know you, one of the questions that we like to ask is, tell us about someone that is either an inspiration to you, someone you look up to, someone that you'd like our listeners to know more about.
Okay. Well, Johnny Appleseed, who's not a real person, I'm told.
Was he not a real person?
That's what I'm told.
Oh, I've lied to my daughters because I've read them a little.
He was not a real person.
I read them a little story, and they asked if he was real.
Evidently, he is an agglomeration of people.
Okay.
Yeah, who were, and that makes sense, doesn't it? Because, when I put on my, straw hat and put my cob pipe in my mouth, I feel like Johnny Appleseed. I'm out in the garden. Although I haven't planted any apple trees yet. But
it's so often that kind of PR campaign to disseminate information or to tell these inspirational stories seem more detrimental than good. For my big example is Newton, right? When you talk about Newton and his development of the gravitational theory, you hear this great PR story about, this brilliant person had an apple drop on their head and then boom, they changed the world. That didn't happen. And tell me he got hit by an apple though.
Tell me that happened.
He noted once.
Don't completely change my world.
He noted once that seeing apples fall from the tree was part of the impetus, part of him thinking about these ideas. Mm-hmm. But the real story is a much more inspirational story about what it takes to do that kind of work. is that this guy dedicated his life to that
Exactly.
work, right?
Absolutely.
4 decades. Went through some pretty traumatic experiences. Came from a rather difficult childhood, right? Like went through all these things and important things in his life that built his character and his drive. And that's the story we should be telling, our children or our students. So not, hey, if you're the lucky one and the red apple falls on your head, you're going to be rich too, right? Like,
that's a very good point, Jared.
So Johnny Appleseed, knowing that that's not a real person, why did you pick Johnny Appleseed?
Well, I mean, one of my many heroes, because I have, they're numerous. But yeah, the fact that this is a person who was an environmentalist, and also what is so important about Appleseed is the fact that what the science is telling us, and this is like recent archaeology. The archaeologists are most fascinated by, of course, the early peoples that we're just now discovering. For example, with the melting away or the regression of the glaciers in northern Europe, for example, they're discovering sites that are several hundred million years old,
that we haven't had
or several hundred before. Several 100,000 years old.
Crazy.
And what they're finding is that when human beings decide to do so, they can have a very positive impact on biodiversity, on environmental sustainability, on the climate, on temperature control, when they decide to do so. And what they discovered recently, and I think that's in Scandinavia, but what they discovered recently is that these were forest people, and the lands that these people inhabited, what is left of the forest are more diverse because of their intervention. So this happened over 100,000 years ago, and those forests are more diverse, they're more fertile, and the companion plants that they planted with them are still thriving.
Boy, that's hard to envision in this day and age. It's hard to envision that the human race could be a net positive for biodiversity. I mean, right now, as we speak, we are presiding over essentially a mass extinction of animals because, we're spreading our civilization wider and wider and encroaching more and more.
And that's why I think that the message of Appleseed is so important, that the individual can make a difference. And we know, for example, that let's talk about the Swinomish for a minute. Swinomish people are Native Americans who live in Washington State and British Columbia. And they were the first tribe of people the first Indian tribe, and there are now 50 who have followed the example of the Swinomish. And
can you say that tribe name again, please?
Swinomish.
Okay.
Swinomish. And do you want to spell it?
No, thank you. No country of origin. No, I just needed to.
Okay, and so anyway, they published their climate proclamation in 2007, acknowledging global temperature rise. and its deleterious effects on virtually every species. Okay, in 2010, just 3 years later, they put their action plan into place. And so what they have done is they live on the coastal regions of Washington and British Columbia. One of the things that they've done is they've gone back to their long-standing tribal tradition, which is several thousand years old, of constructing what they call clam gardens, clam gardens, basically. And it's not just clams that take advantage of it; it's all shellfish. But they call them clam-based gardens. And what they do is very simple. Actually, they just build a rock wall on the tide line. Okay, so right where low tide, where the tide is at its lowest, they build that rock wall so that when the tide comes in again, it deposits sand behind the wall, and that's where the clams, because that's where they find shelter, and that's where they find habitat.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, so anybody else that thinks like that.
And it's so easy. It's such an easy thing. There's so many things that happen in your garden that are beneficial. They're really easy to do.
And we're going to get to that. That's going to be our big question today. We've got one more important question, though, before we get to that, and that is the
drum roll.
The great equalizer here on the Oh That's Cool podcast. Gumby versus Mr. Ed, battle to the death. Who wins? And why?
Okay, well, I tell you what, Jared, you're talking to a knee-jerk deconstructionist here.
Okay. I'm in.
So, for me, that question is really saying, who would you put your money on?
Sure.
In a crisis? Okay, or who would you trust with, your life? And
so you're seeing this as you're choosing a defender.
Well, who would be? One cannot. It's hard. It's difficult to imagine. Miss Ed or Gumby in an agonistic, contest.
Yeah.
Maybe a little checkers, maybe, whatever. But to me, it seems like what that question is really asking is, what are their most admirable qualities? Okay. And, I haven't been around horses a whole lot in my life, but I do want to agree with Gulliver's assumption, or his opinion of horses, with whom he spent a considerable amount of time in their country of origin.
This is Gulliver.
As their guest. Yes, absolutely. The famous Gulliver, the one and only. Okay, and what he said about horses was this: that the horse's most admirable quality, and I'm paraphrasing, okay, is his extraordinary tolerance and thoughtful solicitude of the yahoos, aka humans, entrusted to his care. Okay. Now, but so I mean, yeah, you got to admire Ed for that alone, right? But
sure.
Yeah, and not only that, but he what does he do every morning but check how his stocks are doing, and he actually did. I don't know if you're aware of this, but he actually did a public service series of public service commercials.
I didn't know that.
Yes, telling people to invest in government bonds.
Mr. Ed did a government bonds commercial?
That is true, and occasionally on his program he would mention, I want to see how my bonds are doing. And then
I have underestimated what he brings to the table.
That was the inside joke in that show.
So I think what that shows is maybe the biggest trump card Mr. Ed has here is he is a critical thinker. He critically, as far as we know, just based on the children's programming, Gumby is very rudimentary in his. But
I want to address Gumby as well, if I might.
Oh, sure.
If I may, I want to address Gumby as well. To me, it seems like yes, you're right about Gumby, but you know what? His best friend is guess who?
Yeah, that's of course.
Pokey the horse. Okay, so he has, so in other words, Pokey helps make up for a lot of Gumby's deficiencies.
I don't think Pokey has a diversified portfolio, though.
Okay, now but in a contest between the two, right?
Uh-huh.
I'm thinking that, should Gumby end up as a splat, under, Ed's shoe, that, so in other words, he's just a green blob.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
He's going to pull himself up, right?
That's right.
And go on. So, in other words, there ain't no stomping Gumby.
There you go. So this is not a visual medium, because if it was, I would give that like a standing ovation. That is easily the most forethought put into this. And I mean, we've had like Grayson Forsey on the podcast. Okay, that was the most thought I think I've heard put into that question. And by the way,
and juxtaposed to his answer, he was kind of anti-horse, and this got down to the valor of a horse, the horse having the heart of a warrior.
We're going to lock you and Grayson Forsey in a closet, and you guys are going to have it out on this issue.
Really?
Gulliver, by the way, fictional, right? Is he real as well? I mean, I just got to...
Gulliver is fictional.
Okay. Man.
Another kind of an amalgam of...
Exactly. Yeah.
That was attention to detail right there alone.
There's a chance out there, and you can just sit down and, actually, you're more likely to have a good walk with Pat. Take the opportunity. Just some of the best conversations I've ever had.
No question.
So our big question today, the reason why we brought you on, one of your expertise, how can we be environmental activists in our own backyard?
All right. Well, don't get me started. Yes, it will take a long walk, probably of several miles.
Okay, yeah, all right.
But, I love it.
But the parameters here is backyard exclusive. I mean, is that what we're talking about?
Right.
Or front yard, in your yard.
Okay.
Yeah, well, let's talk about my yard. I think what you want to do is start with compost. And compost can come from anywhere. It's leaf matter, it's green matter, it's kitchen scraps, and you want to have a compost heap. So in other words, you want to collect it, and you want to have a garden fork. You do not need a compost bin. You do not need to buy a $150 or $300 compost bin from Lowe's or Amazon. All you need is just really a spot in your garden. You can use, mount it up like hay. I happen to use just a little circle of cattle panel. So I cut some cattle panel, cut it about 3 feet high, and set it in the ground, and that is my basic compost heap. When I use a combination of a lot of things. I use the French hugelkultur practice of once my compost gets to a certain level of decomposition. And by the way, the fork is important. Let me go back a minute. The garden fork is important because turning your compost heap on a regular basis will keep it from producing methane. Methane is a byproduct of decomposition, but it only occurs if you don't let the compost breathe. Okay? If you let it breathe and turn it regularly, you're not going to have methane, and we don't want any more methane, and that we've got enough of the methane from the big industrial complex, and from, of course, cars too, car emissions. Mostly it's industrialization now.
Should be mentioned, methane is like a supersized version of carbon in its effects on climate change. It is
well, the big issue is there's more, actually there are more carbon dioxide emissions, but the big issue with methane is that carbon emissions will dissipate. Carbon dioxide dissipates a lot more quickly than methane does. Methane stays in the atmosphere much longer, and so that's a big issue. Also, carbon dioxide emissions can be addressed if we have a lot of tree cover, a lot of green things growing in our yard all year round, and so one of the things that I do. And thanks for getting me off the composting. We may get back to that later, but it's more important, I think, to talk about the garden as being a place that life goes on all year round. It doesn't shut down even in the dead of winter. Even in the dead of winter, you've got microorganisms in the soil. You've got insects in the soil. Bees are hibernating in your soil, and so are other insects. You have insects have a phenomenon in which they can actually stop the life cycle. They can interrupt it. It's not quite like hibernation, because hibernation involves just shutting down the slowing down the biological processes, significantly to allow animals to endure an extended heat period or cold period, either one. We see them doing both. Insects are capable of doing actually a suspension of that life cycle. In other words, there may be eggs laid that don't hatch for a year or two until the climate conditions are right. You'll see this phenomenon, interestingly enough, it's very common with red clover mites. When there's a scarcity of clover, and clover is like a lot of plants that appear in your yard, there will be several years when you'll see very little of it in your yard, and the clover mites disappear as well. Where did they go? They're in suspension. They're in suspension.
That reminds me, it's almost like seed germination, right? Same kind of idea as the eggs waiting until the conditions are right.
Yeah.
It's an uplifting feeling for me, because we've had Craig Granger on the podcast before, and he's a gardener himself.
Really?
Jared and him talk about homesteading and how effective they can garden, and my garden is a wasteland, and so it's uplifting to hear that even though I don't see the leafy greens growing out of it, that it's still a roiling area where life is thriving. Because you look at it, it certainly doesn't seem that way.
Well, yeah, and that's an important point, because when plants start to die back, when they go to seed, and when insects start to go, disappear, okay, people think that, it's time to pull everything out. I got to pull everything out, tidy it up, so it can be ready for spring. That is probably one of the worst things that you can do for not only the garden, but the things that live in it, as well as the climate itself. Longleaf grasses, what they do is they pull carbon out of the air all winter long. And the greener those things are, the greener those plants are, the more carbon that they pull out of it. So weeds are our friends. When the plants start growing, and if you leave, there are certain crops that if you leave them in the ground, they will resow. I'm on my third resowing of arugula right now. So I'm eating fresh arugula out of my garden every day, and probably will be eating it for some time to come, because it's not as winter hardy as kale or spinach, but it is pretty winter hardy. So it won't freeze over until temperatures get down in the teens for some time. But those are things to remember. So kale and spinach I will be eating all winter long. Last year, when we had this polar vortex, right, my kale survived it, and so did my leeks, and so did some of the spinach. The rabbits ended up eating it though, but now I've got the spinach cage, so hopefully the rabbits won't get inside the cage and eat my spinach. But
you're helping the environment when you're feeding rabbits.
Exactly. So not only is that kale, because if you're familiar with kale, especially the green leafy kale, it's very dark green. And not only is it in the garden and feeding me all winter long, so I'm getting fresh food, but and it's also pulling carbon out of the soil. But in the spring, guess what? It's one of the first things to flower, because it is going to seed after the winter season. After the winter season, it's done its job, so it's going to seed, and it flowers right when it goes to seed. And the flowers are extremely aromatic, and the early emerging bees and wasps have something to eat. So you're feeding them. You're not only, just by not pulling your tail out. Can you imagine?
So how important are pollinators in this conversation, and how can we better support them?
Extremely important. And we got to remember that it's not just bees that are pollinators. And by the way, most bees live in the ground. It's a misnomer to say that bees live in trees. Very few bees live in trees.
What are some other pollinators that we, namely me, would be surprised by?
Wasps. Most varieties of wasps are pollinators. Butterflies, of course. Mosquitoes are pollinators. They are extremely important pollinators. So when a lot of people were calling for the extermination of mosquitoes a few years back during the Ebola crisis.
Yeah.
It was an important reminder from the agricultural community. No, you're taking away one of our most important pollinators. By the way, bats are pollinators.
Really?
Yes.
Bats.
That one surprised me.
Bats are pollinators.
There's actually some really...
I think there are a couple of varieties of lizards that are pollinators as well.
Well, wasps particularly get a pretty bad name, but recently I've discovered some really beautiful and not aggressive varieties.
Exactly. Right now, this summer for the first time I was visited by the blue California wasp and driven that far away. So originating in California, but driven by the wildfires to force migration away from the wildfires just for survival.
Which is interesting because we don't think about insects as well migrating due to climate change.
They do, yeah.
That's a very good point.
And of course, the most famous migrators of all are the ladybugs, who winter in the California mountains and migrate in clouds of sometimes up to 100,000.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, huge clouds of ladybugs that migrate together, just like geese.
Can I ask a dumb guy question? Somebody just doesn't understand this.
Well, if you don't mind being answered by a dumb girl.
So you say this stuff, rather than uprooting it, leave it where it stands, because these various pollinators can take advantage of it. So here's my silly question. Are we, in doing that and leaving it open for pollinators, does that benefit humanity in any way, or is this just for the benefit of the quote-unquote environment that we live in?
Well, if you don't have pollinators, you don't have fruit. You don't have if you ask an ag person what a fruit is, that's anything that a plant produces that you can eat. So, in other words, in their parlance, green beans are fruit. And beans, what do bean plants do? They flower. That's how they produce their crop. And of course, beans are their crop. Even for example, arugula's got to be pollinated if you want seeds. So
and you do if you want to keep producing.
Yeah, exactly. So without that, they are really I wouldn't say the bottom of the environmental food chain, but they are the foundation upon which every food, that we eat grows. If we didn't have pollinators, we would starve to death.
I learned about this in the documentary Bee Movie. Did you learn about this in the documentary Bee Movie? Yeah, okay. Well, Jerry Seinfeld played a leading role, and we learned about the lives of bees, especially when they sued humanity. Did you get a chance to see this? It's stirring informational movie about bee culture.
It was a cartoon about 20 years ago.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so...
And no, I have not.
Bees sue humanity because we steal all their honey, and then what do they end up doing in the movie? They end up withholding their pollination, and the planet starts slowly dying in a hellish landscape.
So it's a bee rebellion. Well,
litigious.
Well, let me tell you how important pollinators are. China has over the last 10 years, they have so few bees left in the country that they have to hire workers that they provide with little tiny paintbrushes and little tiny cups full of pollen, and they have to pollinate each cherry tree by hand. They have to paint pollen into the flowers in order to get those cherry trees to pollinate. If that, doesn't give you pause, I don't know what would, about how important bees are. because it's not sustainable.
So what else can we do to protect pollinator populations?
Well, for one thing, you have to provide habitat, and you do that by not using pesticides, because pesticides is the number one enemy of any insect, and actually, when you think about it, people too, because we are poisoning ourselves as well as the grasses and the flowers and our fruits.
Famously, recently, the Roundup case where it was causing cancer.
Yeah, exactly.
Cancer.
Yeah.
Really? Roundup was found in a study or something like that to be causing? Wow.
Oh, I think they've known for decades. But
there was finally a documented court case.
Yeah, right. That's usually how these things come to light. Is there's litigation of some sort. Back to I lost my train of thought.
So supporting pollinators with habitat.
Okay, yeah.
Not using pesticides.
Yeah, and of course, what I do in my garden is I have something blooming all season long. So beginning with the kale in the early spring, sorrel. Don't pull your sorrel up. It's the little plant that looks. People mistake it for clover a lot, but it has a beautiful yellow flower, and avoid pulling up those little weeds. That basically what a weed is just a flower that's in somebody's way.
There's your perspective change right there.
Yeah, exactly. And from the bee's point of view, that's food. And if you want bees in your garden, you have to, protect them. You were talking about honey earlier, and I do want to say this, that honeybees actually provide very little pollination. They limit themselves to a very few plants. It's the generalists that are the workhorses of the bee world. And by generalists, I mean carpenter bees, miner bees, the Halictidae, the little shiny bees that are very tiny.
I believe it's called sweat bees.
Well, miner bees are included in that family. It's a huge family, by the way. But you were talking about how wasps get a bad rap. Bees, of course, do too. But a little known fact about bees is that male bees can't even sting, and females.
No, they don't have stingers. No, they don't.
And female bees rarely sting because they are so busy working and collecting pollen. And
we have lived at my house for 14 years and have consistently had a quote-unquote wasp problem. We've had wasps religiously, no matter what we do. They
paper wasps or?
You're asking the wrong guy. They're the big curly-Q ones that make sounds when they fly by your ear. And that's how I would define them. But we've lived there for 14 years, and just it's good to hear you talk about them this way, because I always instinctually, there's a wasp there, but we have never had a single incident of one really even coming close to a person. It's hornets. Hornets we've had problems with, but not wasps or bees.
Do sting, yes. But most wasps are usually paper wasps, and they. I tell you what. Wasps are wonderful friends to a garden because they are cannibals, and not only do they cannibalize the bad bugs. For example, cabbage worms or tomato worms or whatever, they will cannibalize each other. And so if you see wasps, you don't want to witness a wasp meal, because it can be very savage. I have seen a wasp tackle a cabbage worm and eat it whole. The cabbage worm is there to provide food. That is why there are so many of them. That's why cabbage worm flies lay so many eggs.
And to the cabbage, they're heroes.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all perspective.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, is there anything else that you think our audience should know about being good environmentalists in their yard?
Well, think of your garden as not a one-season blooming space. Some people think that having daffodils come up in the spring is their contribution to the flower world. And if that's what you want, it's okay. But if you really want to get invested in environmental sustainability, plant things. Number one, you got to have anchors, which are your perennials. So have several perennials. Do put rocks in your garden, because rocks provide shelter for bees. Bees can and other bugs, can overwinter under rocks.
That's good advice.
Yeah, don't be afraid to have rocks in your garden, or in your bed for that matter.
I'm afraid I don't have a choice in that matter.
I've heard that, or not always. I think someone told me the woody stem plants. Bees will make homes in too. It's
not only bees that do that. There are other insects that do so as well.
So, like with our, we always do sunflowers every year, and they get pretty big. I would leave those stalks. I'll cut them off, kind of
right,
a few inches off the ground, so that if something wants to crawl in there, they can live there.
Yeah, and the advantage of that, mullein does the very same thing. Mullein is actually an immigrant. It comes from Europe, but it's a very furry plant, but the stalks are extremely woody, and it does flower, and there are a variety of insects that are attracted to those flowers, but they also lay eggs in the mullein itself and the woody stalk, and what happens is that the life cycle doesn't stop there, because that mullein will continue to feed. Guess what? Woodpeckers. Woodpeckers are attracted to mullein in the fall, and they will hammer out and take eggs. And of course, again, insect species lay far more eggs than they need to, because they're feeding another, animal higher up in the food chain.
There's a phrase for that. I learned it with sea turtles. It's called swamping the predators or something like that. If you give them too much to eat, then some of you will survive.
That's a great term. I hadn't heard of it, but that's a great term. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the perspective change in a lot of this, because I have not to say that this makes me feel much better about my gardening skills, but I can take some cold comfort in the fact that this area that is green and flowery for a month of my life and then becomes drab and just from the layman's eyes visually hideous, and then brown and seemingly lifeless. It is a 12-month, around-the-clock, nonstop smorgasbord of all these pollinators.
Exactly.
A interesting symbiotic environment that I had no idea I was even housing.
And you can tell if your soil's good if you just dig up a little bit. It should just be swarming. You'll see pill bugs and all kinds of things in there, which is what you want.
Yeah, and composting. Let's go back to that. The big and climate change is causing more and more urban flooding, and the way to mitigate, the easiest way to mitigate that is to compost, because if you compost your soil regularly, and regardless of whether you have a large garden, a small garden, or no garden at all, if you compost your soil regularly, composted soil will absorb 8 inches of water per hour.
As compared to non-composted soil?
As compared to soil that you just let go and do not, change anything.
Now that's fascinating. I hadn't considered the relationship between composting and flooding.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge.
Yeah, a big one, and kind of.
There should be, and ideally, what you want is to look out in your yard after a really, really hard rain and not be able to see any puddles. If you can do that, then you know that your soil is healthy.
Can you give me not a lot of time on this question anyways, but can you give somebody like myself who has puddles in his yard, what is 1, 2, 3 step that I should take to reach the ideal that you're describing?
Okay, what you want to do is compost. And
in that specific area or just in general?
Yeah, as a rule. But yeah, you want to, because what does compost do? It's basically restoring nutrients to the soil. And I gotta say it. I have to. Here it comes.
Is it a swear word?
It's poop.
Oh.
Okay, so in other words, you want to use a little manure, mix a little manure in your compost.
She comes to our house for our chicken manure if you're ever interested.
You traffic in chicken manure?
A little bit.
Okay. All right. That's a heck of a niche industry that you got a foothold in.
But yeah, the point is that your yard is an ecosystem, and even if you don't have flowers in it all year round, you still have grasses in it, and you still have that soil. And the last thing that you want is for that soil to erode, because once that does, then you don't have grasses, then you don't have trees.
And one quick and easy way to do that is don't break your leaves. Mow them.
Yes, mulching up that in the fall. When you mow your yard, just don't rake the leaves up, just mulch. That's excellent.
We do a combination of that and some of them we put into the compost pile. Mm-hmm. And Carla likes to line all the beds with them in the winter. Or being.
Yeah. Well, I live in I have like 3 or 4 huge trees in my backyard, and it mats my yard in like 3 days. And one thing I've been considering doing is what a couple of my friends do is they have, instead of like a barrel for composting, they really have what would look like my garden, but it's just an entire space exclusively for the leaves they rake. Mm-hmm. Although to hear you tell it, while that's fine and everything, they should commit themselves to overturning it or mixing it up from time to time to prevent methane.
It really does help. It really does help. And and another thing that you can do is with those leaf piles, you can even take them and we talked about ugoculture a little bit, but basically what ugoculture is it's taking partially decomposed wood, leaves, etc., and just burying them. And think about, okay, what am I going to do with these leaves? Something needs to be tidied up here. Just bury them in the ground, and they will the leaves will continue to put nourishment into the soil. They also, like we were talking about, they also provide cover for insects. They also provide shredding material for earthworms. You want to attract earthworms. It's a great way to do it. Bury leaves.
Well, it'd be too many things to list today that we've gone through that, frankly, I just did not know.
Is this our last episode of 2021? Because this is a banger to end on. The stuff that we've picked up today.
And boy, this is our first year, isn't it?
It's our first year, yeah. Although kind of an incomplete year. We started in late spring, but so happy that we've gone the journey we've gone this year. We have picked up so many things. I was just re-listening to the podcast with Jeff Jones and how it dovetailed with our conversation with Daniel Ganyemi. This conversation we're having now dovetails beautifully with the conversation that, at least an initial one that we had with Craig Granger. There were so many great conversations between Hal Higdon and that cross paths between Hal Higdon and Dr. Vivian Elder. So anyways, regardless to say, this has been such a rewarding year.
We're doing a good job.
I think so. And we're kind of surfing the talents of the people we bring in. So we're very fortunate that they have been able to grace us with their presence as well.
So this episode is going to finish out not only this year, but this semester. It'll be out on finals week.
Yeah.
We'll come back next year. We've already got a great episode planned out. If I haven't told you yet, we're going to bring in Richard Wells to talk about Dungeons & Dragons.
I did not know that.
We've been looking for
you and I have been itching to have that conversation. Yeah.
That's right. So we will be back next year. It'll be out the first week of classes, which I can't remember off the top of my head what that date is. January 18th?
That sounds like the neighborhood of when it is.
Martin Luther King Day, I believe, 18th or 19th. But as I was saying, as you were saying, yes, a fantastic guest to end the year with more information than I could just list. This will definitely be one to go back through and listen to again for lots of great tips and information about how we can better serve the environment. Andrew, did you know that?
I did not know that.
I didn't know that either.
Now you do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well,